Hi, I'm Skip Nipper. Welcome to Skip's Corner, the podcast where I tell you about not only Nashville's great baseball history and traditions,
shot to right, a one-hop liner,
but certainly about its past. And you will hear a little bit about its present and future, too.
Yes, he can. It makes the waist-high catch.
There are great stories about Tom Wilson Park, Herschel Greer Stadium, Sulphur Dell, and the players, coaches, and fans who love everything about baseball. And every once in a while, you will get to hear from a special guest who will share their fondness and even passion for the great game.
The high fly ball down the right field corner, going way back, hits a lead-off home run.
Well, my guest today is Keith Wood, and you're really going to enjoy listening to him. We met some time ago through SABRE, through our Nashville chapter. He spoke, and through some other conversations we've had mostly online. But he is the author of a wonderful book, The Memphis Red Sox. And if you've never heard of the Memphis Red Sox, or if you want to know more about Negro Leagues history or Memphis history in some respects, you need to read Keith Wood's book, The Memphis Red Sox. Now, a little bit about Keith. Born in Albany, New York, grew up in Schenectady, attended St. John Fisher College, and in 1994 came to Memphis at Sheffield High School, where he became the head boys basketball coach, and was at that time, at the age of 25, one of only four white coaches in Memphis City Schools. He's married. How many children do you have, Keith?
Three
boys.
Three boys. They're all grown now. They are, 27, 25, and 22.
Yeah. And your wife's name?
Sherry.
And he moved to Millington Central High School in Shelby County as a history teacher, boys head basketball coach, and completed his master's in history at the University of Memphis. Go Tigers, go. I went to Memphis State. I don't know if I told you that or not.
Okay.
Probably way before you did.
Oh, yeah, a few years. I got down here as quick as I could.
My diploma says Memphis State University, and I think that's what it'll always be to me. You moved again, this time to Christian Brothers High School, and that's where you are now.
It is.
And it did not include coaching for your role at that time, but it offered you the opportunity to return to grad school and complete your doctorate in history. And you began searching for a topic, and Memphis Red Sox was one of the ideas, but what was the one that you chose?
I ended up choosing Larry Finch's career, right? The iconic, the first star Black basketball player at Memphis State, who only a short time after the assassination of Martin Luther King in Memphis, King was assassinated in 1968, but Finch led the Memphis Tigers to the national championship game against Bill Walton and the UCLA Bruins in 1973, and really became a healing salve for the community that brought the community together to watch basketball, and really intrigued me with how sport can bring us together. And so just had a great time. I coached against many of the guys that were Larry Finch's teammates. I've actually worked the Larry Finch basketball camp when I was younger.
Very good.
And so it was just a great opportunity to have that conversation and to share his story. And I was kind of surprised when I got to grad school in, 2012, 2013, and I'm looking at my doctorate, and no one had done anything on Larry Finch in Memphis, which surprised me. But it also opened the door for the research and what ends up being my first book, Memphis Hoops, right? So great opportunity. I was intrigued when I was in grad school with the Memphis Red Sox. There was a gentleman that did his dissertation on the Memphis Red Sox about 15, 20 years ago, Montgomery McBee, and he did a great job chronologically telling the story of the Memphis Red Sox. And so when I came back to this story after publishing Memphis Hoops, McBee's dissertation was never published. Nobody ever picked it up. And so gave me an opportunity to deconstruct his work and to sort of rework it thematically and tell the story of this once proud Negro League organization, right? Stood from 1922 to 1959, arguably the longest standing continuous organization all in Negro League baseball. The Birmingham Black Barons last longer, but they had a 2 or 3 year hiatus in the late 30s, early 40s. I'd have to go look those years up. And the ownership group of the Memphis Red Sox is, preeminent, right? They're on the cutting edge. J.B. Martin ends up being the president of the Negro American League at the end of the Negro League era. W.S. Martin holds on to the Red Sox community and ownership group when his brother moves to Chicago, right? So there's some great storylines that need to be remembered, and I think this was an opportunity to share those.
Well, tell me, the neighborhood that you grew up in was different ethnicities?
It was in Schenectady. I grew up in a neighborhood. I technically didn't live on Hamilton Hill. I lived between Hamilton Hill and Steinman's Homes, federally funded housing projects. So my high school, it was a large immigrant community, a large number of Italians, Poles, Jews, and then an African-American community. So when I looked around on the basketball team, there were 2 or 3 guys, actually 2 other guys that looked like me, and most everybody else didn't. So I had a lot of questions, and I just became friends. And the reason why I had questions, I would wonder, why did people treat my friends who, when somebody said, when I grew up, if you rolled the basketball out, if you could play, you would play. It didn't matter anything else. And that's what sports does. Sports gives us an opportunity, egalitarianism, this opportunity to let the sport decide who the best player is, right? Regardless of all the other names, labels that we want to throw on people. Sports is the great equalizer. And when I was on trips, and we would go on road trips, I'd hear stuff in the stands and on the way out of games. And I really, became good friends with these guys. Like, they're my brothers. These guys were my wedding. I still keep up with them to this day. Why? Right. So that was the question. So, and then I moved to Memphis. Right. And so, being one of 4 white basketball coaches, varsity basketball coaches in the city of Memphis, you can imagine I was in a lot of gyms where I would be the only person not of color, right? And so just getting to know people and understanding their lived experiences gave me some insight that allowed me to write this book on the Memphis Red Sox, because I began to understand what it was really like in South Memphis, at least in the 90s, right? And so making the jump to go back to the 1940s and 50s is not as far-fetched, because I coached against BTW High School. And if you came out of the Blair T. Hunt gym and walked across the railroad tracks, you were sitting in the outfield of Martin Stadium. It's right there. Now, the stadium's no longer there, unfortunately, but the history is, right? And the community is still a very strong community. And I think that's important. In fact, I've just been asked recently, the city of Memphis is going to open up a South Memphis Museum. And I've been asked to sit on the board to make sure that the story of the Red Sox is told there. And I'm very thankful for that opportunity.
Terrific. Well, you're drawing from the neighborhood to the integrated schools, and the position that you were put in had to have helped you in trying to understand the mindset of, you can't get there if you haven't experienced it, but certainly it had to have some influence on you in writing this. And what I want to say, that you're tender to it. I think it helps to be tender to what others went through. My interest in Negro Leagues baseball came because there was no information, and I'm sure that was a struggle for you as well. Maybe not a struggle, but certainly a roadblock from time to time, or a hurdle. So it just interested me then when I read your bio, that the neighborhood that you grew up, I knew it had to have some influence when you get in your coaching career. Then you automatically, when you chose the Memphis Red Sox, you kind of had an idea about what they were going through. So it's not just the historical aspect, the standings, the ownership, the stadium, but it's more than that. It's into what they had to deal with, even if they were within a black setting, because that was still very, very hard, wasn't it?
Well, I think if you're talking about other Negro League teams, you can get into the Homestead Grays or the Posies group and the Crawfords. And if you look at the Kansas City Monarchs, a lot of these teams are going to be up north, right? And so understanding the racial dynamics of Memphis is important to telling the Red Sox story, right? This is a Jim Crow. Boss Crump is, he's running Memphis, right?
Oh yeah, no doubt.
In order to navigate politically those waters, you sort of have to kiss the ring. And if you don't, there's a whole chapter in my book that J.B. Martin, who didn't kiss the ring and said, no, I'm a black Republican and I'm going to support Wendell Willkie in 1940. And Boss Crump goes, oh no, yellow dog Democrats back here, my guy. If you're either going to kiss the ring or you're going to get run out of town. And they did, right? So he paid a price and ended up making the Great Migration, forced Great Migration to Chicago. Now he picked up and did very well in Chicago. But if it hadn't been for Boss Crump running J.B. Martin out of town, he's probably the most preeminent black politician in the city's history. Now, the Church family is going to sort of take that role when Martin disappears. And the Church family by far deserves the recognition on that level. But it's almost as if J.B. Martin is erased from Memphis political history because of the racial dynamics of politics in the 1930s and 40s in Memphis, Tennessee. And so for the Red Sox to be able to be a black-owned enterprise in Memphis during this segregated era tells a whole nother story. The Birmingham Black Barons were owned most of the time by a white owner, Bull Connor. But if you get down to Rickwood, Bull Connor was the guy calling the games on the mic.
Sure was.
Can you imagine Bull Connor and his racist terminology and terms he would use when he described Willie Mays and other players on the Barons? Like, what were you going to do, right? Like, you're talking about a team owned by a white man, and you got the white sheriff of Birmingham. Memphis has a totally different trajectory. Everybody in the organization was black. The ownership was black. The players were black. And this created an intense sense of pride in this. And I think people sometimes miss the importance of HBCUs in the black community. Well, in that same way, these Negro League organizations, especially the Memphis Red Sox, stood as a pillar of black success in the community. And I think that's part of the story that needs to be told.
Well, I think you stated that very well. I just remember some of the stories that I've heard from people like Jim Zapp and Sidney Bunch Jr. with the pride that they had in playing ball. Two teams that usually came up in their conversations was not the Homestead Grays and certainly the Kansas City Monarchs, but the Birmingham Black Barons and the Memphis Red Sox. I think the Memphis Red Sox were highly respected within those circles. So what kicked it all off? What started after the Finch book?
Right. And so, I had gone to Cooperstown doing my grad work, and I met Leslie Heafy, who works at Kent State University. Yeah. She's one of the organizers of the Jerry Malloy Conference. Yeah. And she was up in Cooperstown, and I just did a very cursory presentation on the Memphis Red Sox, right? Like I had written in my master's work, did a research seminar on the Red Sox, and she sort of worked with me in getting an article published on the years when J.B. Martin was run out of town by Crump. And so she was a huge fan. That article was published in Black Ball Journal. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. Does great work with Negro League baseball. I was like, well, that's there. Now, I can't do the dissertation because I would have to, in your doctoral studies, it has to be unique, right? So Finch's story gave me the opportunity to be unique, whereas the Red Sox story would have been much more complicated to recraft that. So now I'm done, right? So this is me as a professional historian now. McBee's dissertation was in the 90s, all right? So the copyright for dissertation is 15 years. So we've passed that. That's not going to be an issue. In fact, but I did search for McBee, just wasn't able to track him down. There were 2 or 3 professors at Memphis that were trying to help me out with that. But I want to give him a lot of credit, right? Because his dissertation did a lot of the legwork that made publishing that book easy. In fact, he worked with Stephen Ross and John Haddock at the University of Memphis or Memphis State, and they did this documentary called Blue City's Black Diamonds. And they did it in the 1990s, right about the time that McBee was doing his dissertation. And there was a vault at the University of Memphis in the special collections that had 200 VHS tapes. So, Skip, I went into the library for about 2 or 3 months, pretty much every day. Yeah. And I brought out a VCR player. It was a TV and a VCR player. And I plugged those bad boys in there. And I'm hearing directly from the guys that played for the Red Sox, Bob Boyd, Verdell Mathis, Larry Brown Jr., whose dad was Larry Brown Sr. Right. I mean, you name Casey Jones, the catcher that replaced Brown. your listeners this. These guys were so happy. They remember this as the greatest time in their lives. And, you and I want to go, oh my gosh, how did these guys survive segregation? Their pay was worse than white baseball. How did they look back so fondly? And they did. And it was a really neat insight. Double Duty was in there, and they did an interview with Double Duty.
No kidding.
Man, every bit of the character that everybody talks about, that's him. After watching him, I know he's a heck of a salesman, but just listening to the stories and the other guys talk about it, the fact that Larry Brown Sr. and Double Duty Ratcliffe are not in the Hall of Fame is still problematic. I think the way that the Hall evaluates Negro League players is as problematic as when organized baseball kept these guys out of the game in the 40s and 50s. Like they're throwing a token. They're throwing out one Jackie Robinson and Josh Gibson. They're like, well, yeah, we got a couple of guys in.
Oh, yeah.
And it's unfortunate. But I think that if guys like myself can keep telling these stories, that the pressure will remain on organized baseball and the Hall of Fame to be more inclusive of the guys whose careers deserve a second look and an opportunity to be among the icons, not just in Black baseball in Kansas City at the Kansas City Negro League Museum, but in Cooperstown in the Hall of Baseball, right?
Who did the interviews for these players?
Stephen Ross and John Haddock. Most of them were done in Memphis. The National Civil Rights Museum hosted a couple of sittings with these guys as they came in. And then the two professors. Now, it's funny, Stephen Ross is a film professor, and John Haddock is a math professor. And you got to ask the question, how'd you get involved with Negro League baseball? And John has the biggest repository of Memphis Red Sox memorabilia in the city, bar none. Wow. He was a huge aid. He's in the acknowledgments, right? And his attic is like one half of it is nothing but Red Sox memorabilia. He actually has a red sock, like one of the players from Red Sox. Like it's pictures, it is unreal. And he would just jump in a car. And if Dr. Ross couldn't go, he'd go by himself and he'd interview these guys. Montgomery McBee would go along as far as his schedule allowed. And really, those three guys did a yeoman's level of work. I tried to get the University of Memphis to re-release that documentary at the same time the book came out. That gets to be an interesting with copyright and who's going to do who, what, where, when, and why. But that's just a part of the business, right? But their story is incredible.
Well, I missed that here in Nashville. I guess once again, I said that I was interested in, it piqued my interest when I found out that there was so little information when Baseball in Nashville was published in 2007. Mm-hmm. Man, I was singing the blues about what little information there was. I got most of it from Butch McCord, and even Butch McCord would want you to come over to his home and see the things that he had, which mostly was paper. I mean, it was newspaper clippings and books, and he did have some VHS tapes. I wondered what happened to them, but I don't think that they're rare. Something about some of the outings that they'd be invited to, like for the Atlanta Braves or up in Ashland, Kentucky, and things like that.
Well, some of the guys, like Joe B. Scott, becomes the voice of the Red Sox. He stays in Memphis for the rest of his life. He never gets married. He's a member of a Catholic church here in town, St. Mary's, actively engaged. And he actually is very engaged with what was the Memphis Chicks that become the Memphis Redbirds to the St. Louis organization. He actually gets like a permanent seat, admission, and they always have a Negro League Day as long as he was alive. And Joe B. Scott is in one of the chapters. I take a look at Verdell Mathis, who I think is by far the best pitcher Memphis ever has. Maybe deserves recognition by the Hall. Probably won't get there because his career was shortened by arm surgery. Larry Brown, who we've mentioned before, but Joe B. Scott wasn't the player those guys were. But he becomes the voice when no one was asking questions about the Negro Leagues. Joe B. Scott kept the name alive in the city of Memphis, and John Haddock knew Joe B. Scott. And many of the Negro Leaguers that came back were because John would go see Joe B., and Joe B. would just pick up the phone and these guys would come in. And it was like a fraternity, right? And Joe B. was, I believe it was drafted by the Milwaukee Brewers sometime in the 90s. When people sort of had this rebirth renaissance of Negro League baseball a little bit. They actually held a draft for many of the Negro Leaguers that were still alive. Joe B. got picked up by the Brewers, which was neat. So, I mean, he was actually he wasn't bad. Like Roger Hornsby picked him up in a camp over in Arkansas. And if W.S. Martin wasn't such a cheapskate, one of the owners, he might have got a chance to play a little more in organized baseball and a B level or a C level minor league back then. But there was some politics between Negro League baseball and organized baseball. Once Jackie went over, it wasn't smooth. Everybody wasn't happy. Bob Boyd pitched in the Memphis organization. And in fact, W.S. Martin, who takes over the team in the 50s when J.B. leaves in 40, and his little brother B.B. are running the team. And B.B. makes a side deal with the Chicago White Sox and doesn't tell his brother W.S. about it. And it just gets really interesting because many of the black owners are like, well, you're taking the best that we have. You're killing our product. Like, who's going to come to watch second-rate baseball? Yeah. And how much money did Branch Rickey give to the Kansas City Monarchs, right? And we know that Effa Manley made a big stink when Larry Doby goes up with the Cleveland Indians. So Vivek gives her some money, right? It's not equitable, but it's more than Branch Rickey gave that. So there's a lot of dynamics going on as Negro League baseball falls apart economically, because organized baseball has started to take the best players that were in Negro League baseball. And then the product that gets left is probably minor league level, which then leads many historians or many folks that aren't familiar with the Negro Leagues to go, well, that was just second-rate baseball. Yeah. And I think that's the sad part. Hopefully, when you read this book, you'll understand that this was major league level baseball, right? And so that's one of my hopes.
Let's go way back a little bit, and then I'm going to bring you back to that. Was it 1938 championship team?
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Been the best Memphis Red Sox team.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. The one. There was a couple of Negro Southern League championships that were considered minor league, but the Negro American League championship in '38 is the one.
Well, let's go to Negro Southern League, but let's go all the way back to 1886.
Ooh, okay.
So that's where Negro Leagues are forming. NABL is not in that conversation, I don't believe, in 1886. But what other teams were a part of that? Do you recall?
Wow, you are talking about a period of time. Now, number one, we got hit with yellow fever twice, so we lost our charter. Yeah. And so Memphis was being run by Nashville. And really, it's the Memphis is like the Wild West. Like the crime rate is incredibly high. It's not until legitimately we'll bump ahead until Edward Hall Crump comes in as a progressive mayor in 1915, wins election twice, gets booted for believing that alcohol is what we need in the city during an era of prohibition in the state, and wins election, resigns, and then turns it over and becomes Boss Crump. Up until that time, there are a number of teams that are playing, but there's nothing in my research, right? And so I jump in around 1922, right? Yeah. There's one player that goes up and he's playing in Syracuse in the International League, and he comes back and he's a barber. And one of the teams that's a precursor to the Red Sox are A.P. Martin's Barber Boys.
There you go.
And so there's some connections there, but it's very a loose conglomerate. It's like barnstorming. It's a lot of barnstorming against local teams. And as the color line is getting drawn back in organized baseball, black baseball is trying to find itself, right? Where do you go? Pugilism, boxing is big, right? So where does that entertainment money go? It's really interesting to see that it wasn't the Martin brothers who picked up the team. Originally, it was Robert Lewis, who was a funeral home director, right? One of the positions of respectability in the South for many African Americans are going to be teachers, nurses, and funeral home directors, right? Because those you're always going to need all three of those. The Lewis family is very prominent in Memphis. In fact, you can drive down to Walnut Grove and still see the Lewis Funeral Home. It's about 2 miles from my house.
No kidding.
They did a great job, right? Like, so building a stadium, it was originally Lewis Park until the Martin brothers buy it out in 29. Not only was Lewis Park where the Red Sox played, it was also politically where the black community could gather without interference from the white community. And I think people miss that, right? So if you're in Memphis and you're black and you have a political idea, if you air that, that could be dangerous to your job or to your health. And so having a black-owned stadium with its baseball team, Robert Lewis brought in, J.B. Martin, before he gets involved with the Red Sox, is, like I said, a very prominent political member, one of the first guys to open up an NAACP chapter in the city. And Lewis would have these guys speak on opening day. Lewis Park became the largest gathering space for Blacks in the city of Memphis. It had been Church Auditorium. And then when the stadium opens up, probably about 2-3 miles south of Church Park, it becomes the preeminent place. So I think it's not just baseball. It's a place of community. It's a safe space. Black pastors would cut their sermons short. And if you've ever been to a Black church, that usually doesn't happen.
Yeah, that's right.
That's the ones that I've been to here in town. Because I would always go with my players. Like, let's go to church. I'll go to your church. You go to mine.
Good for you.
And it's really interesting to see that when you read about that, going, okay, that must mean that this means something. If a large number of these guys are like, okay, after the game, you're coming back, right? But we'll get you out to the doubleheader that's out at the park. So I think that's important to sort of see that and to understand the community a little better.
It's very similar to Nashville's story. I would not have expected it to be much different in the 19th century. They mostly in the Black community had clubs, but there was also the colleges, Roger Williams University, Fisk University. Those colleges had teams, and they played each other, and they played Rock City Club. There were a couple of those. Some were Black and some were white. You move into the 1900s, it seems like there's less information about that. And when you get into 1920, when the Negro Southern League is formed, Memphis is not part of that, but Nashville is, and that's opposite of the one that was formed in 1886. But going forward, Memphis was a part of the Negro Southern League, because I know Turkey Stearns played, I think, in 22, was from Nashville.
So Robert Lewis is going to have his eye on getting Memphis into the Negro National League. So in 24 and 25, I believe those are the 2 years. For 2 years, Memphis joins the Negro National League with the Birmingham Black Barons.
Yeah, Nashville, I think Tom Wilson, I think that really irritated him. I think he really wanted to be a part of that, and he couldn't. And ended up building his own ballpark because he felt like maybe that would be an attraction for the teams coming from the north. But
now, one thing that Birmingham and Memphis found out, because you're talking about 1924-25, remember you're sitting on the precipice of the Great Depression. And the flood that happened in the Mississippi Valley, I believe it was 25 or 26, really destroys any foundation that the Black community of Memphis had before the Great Depression. And in fact, most historians will argue in Memphis that the Great Depression hits the city of Memphis in 27 and 28, a few years ahead of the stock market crash in New York City. With the economic struggles to travel the lengths that the Negro National League needed, Robert Lewis brings Memphis, and Birmingham joins him, coming back to the Negro Southern League for a couple of years. And then in 28, Lewis sells the team after the 28 season to the Martin brothers. And the Martin brothers really do a good job of jumping into leadership in the Negro Southern League. And the league meetings move to Memphis, right? They're going to be at the South Florida drugstore, placing Memphians prominently in the Negro Southern League in the leadership. There's a couple of instances where the ownership in Birmingham is getting challenged. Ruby Foster, before he gets ill, tries to have a different white man take over the team from the Birmingham, and it gets ugly. And the Martin brothers will come in and adjudicate that, side with the local owner. It sort of marks the moment where the Martin family becomes very prominent in Negro League baseball, and it's through their leadership in the Negro Southern League. And then when they joined this new Negro American League in the early 30s, across the river in Arkansas, there was a gentleman by the name of Claybrook, African-American man who owned a huge farm and had a lot of money. And he put up a baseball team in the Negro Southern League, and he actually brought in Double Duty Radcliffe. He was playing at the other stadium in town, challenging the Red Sox. And in fact, they started to beat the Red Sox on the field. So when the Negro American League opens up, the Martin brothers, seeing that there's some tension there, that they could actually lose their position, join the Negro American League and bump up to the major leagues at a time when the Claybrook Tigers were actually challenging them for that position. It's really interesting dynamic. And then, from there on forward, when they're in the Negro American League, this next iteration, they're really considered major league all the way through, the end of the era.